Hi everyone, Danny here. Today I'll be talking to Professor Anthony Blazevich regarding warm-up for athletic performance. Professor Blazevich is a professor for biomechanics and director of the Center for Exercise and Sports Science Research at Edith Cowan University. All right, let's get down to it. Hi everyone, Danny here. Today we have Professor Anthony Blazevich from ECU to talk to us about the methods regarding warm-up, as well as his recent paper that differentiates between post-activation potentiation and post-activation performance enhancement. Okay, thank you, Professor. So to begin, let's start with warm-up. There are people who think that warm-up isn't really necessary. Can we have your thoughts on that?
To be absolutely honest, warm-up as a global term, I think my opinion is it's absolutely essential to peak performance. So obviously in this forum, we're really going to be talking about athletes, right? So we're not talking about people in their daily lives or clinical population, but we'll just stick to high-performance athletes at the moment. So there are a couple of aspects to warm-up. If we just define it, you could define it just as the muscle temperature increase, because originally when you did some sort of pre-competition or pre-training tasks, the idea was you increased muscle temperature. We knew how effective that was for performance enhancement. So we call it a warm-up, but actually warm-up has a number of other benefits, and probably the most important benefit in a warm-up is specific task practice. So even if you're an elite athlete, and every single day for 20 years, you've practiced your sport. So you're exceedingly brilliant in your motor patterns. The brain is still not perfect, and it needs a reminder every day. And the brain is highly plastic, so it changes incredibly rapidly. In fact, if I was to stimulate my brain at the perfect spot that made my thumb do this, and then I just practice a few times going in the other direction, and I stimulate my brain absolutely identically. Now, instead of my brain doing this, my brain does this. So just a small change in the task, the same area of my brain gets excited, a whole different movement pattern comes down. After about 20 minutes, that's reversed again. In other words, a very small amount of incorrect practice can massively and detrimentally affect your motor performance. And this is why even the most elite athletes in the world, Usain Bolts and Katie Ledeckis and these sorts of people, always perform drills and perfect running or swimming or whatever practice prior to their event, because it's so essential for motor pattern optimization. We also know that the total amount of sort of drive down to the muscles can be increased by perfect task practice. And I'll just remind you that if you do imperfect task practice, it almost certainly will create a negative effect, what we often call perseveration effects. And that is the movement pattern you're doing now, if you practice it, it will persevere or continue. So if you do a similar task, that task will be negatively affected. You guys already know that because you work with triathletes, and you know how difficult they find it to go from the cycling leg to the running leg, because they are similar enough. And there's a movement pattern interference or perseveration of the motor pattern that takes some time to overcome. So if you do incorrect warm-up or task practice, so if your athletes aren't being perfect in their warm-up tasks, they will actually not only not improve, but they can actually negatively improve. And maybe if you remind me, we'll come back to this, because in PAPE studies, you'll often see this delay of many, many minutes before you see a performance enhancement. That's almost certainly not because of fatigue, like most people say. It's almost certainly this perseveration or motor pattern interference effect. In other words, what they're doing is actually ruining you, not helping you. So let's come back to that when we talk about PAP. So I just want to remind you that warm-up in the broader sense has massive implications for motor pattern and perfect motor patterns during sports, even in the most elite. Now, I just really quickly just want to talk about temperature. There are lots of reasons we do warm up. Temperature is clearly the one. And I'm very surprised that so many people seem to forget the effect of temperature. And again, this probably comes because of all this PAP research, where people have assumed that the performance enhancement comes from a myosin phosphorylation, and we'll talk about that later. In fact, the majority of the performance enhancement under dynamic conditions, and the higher the speed, the more effect there is, comes from temperature, because the temperature improvement, of course, improves myosin ATPase, which increases the rate of cross-bridge cycling, so your muscles shorten much faster. This means they are able to produce higher power outputs, and that's really effective. And in fact, it looks like a 1 degree rise in muscle temperature could create something like a 5 or 6% increase in power output. I mean, that's massive, right? Because you're talking about 1 and 2% differences between gold medal and not being on the dais. And I'm telling you that a 5% improvement can be gained just by 1 degree improvement in temperature. So we know that muscle temperature is an absolute key. And the faster you're moving, the more important temperature is. Because temperature's effects aren't on the force part of muscle. It doesn't increase the total force of each cross bridge pulling in the muscle. What it does is increases the cycling rate. So it means that muscles are effectively faster, and it means that there's more cross bridges attached to the actin pulling on the muscle at any time. So temperature is really important for muscle velocity. And that's why the faster you move, the more important temperature is to you. So, you know, I'll probably leave it there as the effective warm-up. We could go into muscle water accumulation and a whole bunch of other probable benefits for you. But I would say motor patterns and temperature are absolutely key, and therefore a proper warm-up is really important.
So we probably want to have the last activity for the warm-up using activity that are really specific to the sport itself, isn't it?
Yes, and this is why, you know, and again, for decades, people have said to us, your warm-up should be, you know, general to specific, and it should be low intensity to high intensity, short range of motion to long range of motion. And again, I feel like those basics, people have forgotten them, you know, because we do a general warm-up because we just want temperature, and we don't want to go straight to high intensity because there is maybe an injury risk. So we slowly move through larger ranges of motion. We slowly increase force as our tissues get more loading and more temperature and more compliance. And we eventually end up at the point where we are able to generate these massive forces and these high power outputs. And when you're now able to do it without injury risk, that's of course when you're almost ready for performance. That's when you need to be very, very perfect in your movement pattern, because it looks like the closer you are to your sporting movement pattern, the more it's important to practice it, but also the bigger the consequence if you're not practicing perfectly. I mean, if I do a vertical jump and then I come and do this with my arms and then do a vertical jump, I don't get an interference. But if I do a vertical jump and then I sit on a bike for 30 seconds and then do another vertical jump, if I'd already warmed up properly, remember, if I've already done a perfect warm-up for vertical jumping, and then I do a bicycle sprint and try and jump, my vertical jump is usually lower, even though the fatigue is almost zero. So this is where the perfect practice is really important when you're starting to move at the very highest power outputs. That is, the closer you are to your competition and the more ready you are because of your excellent warm-up, the more important it is to be perfect in your movement patterns.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about the rest period between the end of the warm up and as well as the actual activity? Because like in elite sports, they often finish up their warm up and then they have to go to the waiting room, and that takes a fair bit of time before they start their event. And often in the waiting room, they don't get to do anything, and back onto the field.
Yes, so I think if anyone in elite sport wants to do research into what we might call PAP or warm-up, I think this is the place to do it. And your reasons are perfect. So you do this perfect warm-up. and let's say you've got everything right, you then have this period where you're not practicing the movement and when muscle temperature is reducing. There is no doubt that anything you can do to retain muscle temperature, even if it's passive, will have benefits. So putting your tracksuit back on, you know, again, if you're outdoors and in Singapore, it may not be a big problem. If you're outdoors in Finland, it will be a huge problem, you know. So take into account environmental temperature. Maintaining muscle temperature is a real key, even if it's done passively. Then there you got the motor control aspects. Now notice if you're, say, a sprint runner, you'll go out on the track, you have to fix your blocks, you have to find your block spacings. You'll do a few run-throughs and a few drills, then you'll do a few practice starts to make sure your blocks are perfect. So what these sprinters are able to do is not only get their temperatures back up, but practice the task again. And that's really important, that when you're just mucking around getting your blocks right, you're again practicing perfectly. But if you're a swimmer, that's really difficult. Even the poor backstrokers are no longer allowed to jump in and then do a backstroke back to the wall. You know, you have to jump in and stay there. So what does a swimmer do? Now, I don't have all the answers, but I would guess, my belief would be that if you can do any kind of maximal contractions that maintain your motivation and maintain central drive in some way and maintain muscle temperature. And this is why in a few studies, people have done things like a few vertical jumps and then found that swimming performance can still be enhanced. That might be because the push off the wall is better, but remember, vertical jump is not swimming, so you're unlikely to cause this motor pattern interference, but you are likely to gain both a psychological or motivational benefit of trying to jump maximally, sort of to re-stimulate your noradrenergic drive, your adrenal system, and you're also likely to increase whole body blood flow and muscle temperature. And so it's possible that even something like a few vertical jumps before a swimming race could benefit performance. The second thing that I don't believe has been well studied, and you guys might want to set up a study on this, is the use of mental imagery. There are excellent studies showing that mental imagery massively increases corticospinal excitability, that if you combine mental imagery with warm-up, there are all these benefits. As an athlete, I used to use mental imagery a lot. I use it a lot in rugby players at halftime to reimagine what they're about to do on the rugby field after that halftime break. And I think that just closing your eyes, going into yourself and doing internal motor imagery immediately prior to a performance may really help with the movement pattern aspects if you've had a long break between the warm-up ending and your competition performance. Something that's worth looking at.
I see. That's great. Oh, yeah, one more thing. You're one of those who actually debunk the mean of static stretching causing detrimental effect on muscular power. Yeah. So can you explain on that a little bit?
Yeah. So it turns out that if you hold a static stretch on a muscle for a prolonged period of time, so it looks like you need at least, you know, about 1 minute of stretching a muscle. Although if you do stretch multiple muscles, there seems to be a cumulative effect. So if you only stretch 30 seconds, but you stretch 5 muscles, we can still see this effect. What we tend to see is a reduction in the neural drive to the muscle. This seems to be, based on our evidence, associated with the loss of an amplification system that occurs in your spinal cord. So actually this central drive failure isn't to do with the brain function, it's to do with the spinal cord function. And that's limiting the central drive to the muscle, and it probably lasts 5 to 15 minutes. There can be, if you do a lot of stretching, now we're talking about 5 minutes, probably repeated stretches to, you know, very sort of extreme angles, you can get an even longer reduction in performance. So the muscle seems to be affected more than as much as the nervous system. And after about 15 minutes, the nervous system has recovered, but there's an ongoing 3 to 5% loss in the muscle that can last an hour. And that seems to be at the muscle level itself. Okay, so let's just be clear. If you're doing a lot of static stretching or PNF stretching, for example, there is a risk of a reduction in muscle force production. That seems to be a loss of central drive predominantly, but there may be also a smaller ongoing effect of the muscle. But here's the key. To get that detrimental effect, you need a lot of stretching. I mean, you need to hold a muscle for a minute. No athlete I know does that. The other thing is that it is readily reversible. So usually between stretching and performing your task, you've had plenty of time to overcome it. So it's, even if you do a lot of stretching because you felt the need, it's really only going to last 5 or 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, unless you've done incredibly intense and probably repetitive stretching for many minutes. And then there's a few % failure for a prolonged period of time. So what does this mean for athletes? Well, it means for athletes who are holding stretches for 5 or 10 seconds per muscle and doing multiple muscle groups, and they do it usually somewhere early in their warm-up and then have to finish all their warm-up and everything else, static muscle stretching is going to have zero negative effect on performance. In other words, if an athlete feels that they want to do some static stretching, as long as it's not excessive, it's no problem at all. In fact, one study we ran showed that if you allow athletes to stretch, whichever stretch they prefer, so it can be static stretching, dynamic stretching, if they feel that they have stretched, they feel more mentally prepared for exercise. And this could be just as important as the physical, right? So allowing people to stretch if they feel the need to do it is probably important. You just make sure that it's not excessive prior to an exercise task. So my summary on this is there's a lot of misinformation about the role of stretching. Actually, there are lots of benefits to stretching, and that includes an acute improvement in range of motion, a perception or feeling of readiness for intense exercise, but also it can reduce sympathetic drive. So if you're overstimulated, if you're stressed, whether that's prior to an exercise or a competition, or if it's after the competition and you're trying to recover, or you're just anxious about things in daily life, stretching can reduce that. In fact, stretching is more effective than yoga for reducing stress and anxiety and sympathetic drive. So there are benefits to stretching, but if you're going to do it prior to a competition or prior to an intense training session, just keep the durations moderate and make sure that there's a bit of a warm-up between your stretching and your actual performance.
Cool. All right. Let's get to the PAP paper. So what got you started on it?
Say that again. Sorry, what was the question?
So what got you? What actually made you realize that there is a difference between the PAP and PAPE? Because like personally, I did a couple of research on that as well, but I've been using the term PAP, as you remember, on Twitter.
Yeah. So I guess the key was this. I mean, I consider myself an applied sports scientist, even though I tend to study some mechanisms, and I like to understand all the mechanisms and how not just humans, all animals function, because if you understand function, if you understand how a muscle fiber contracts, if you understand the actual mechanisms of fatigue, if you understand how movement patterns are optimized, then you can start to second guess your applied work. And what I think is happening is a lot of people who are in the applied world are moving away from actually learning their very basics of physiology, the basics of psychology, the basics of biomechanics, which means that they are open to error because they see something, think it makes sense, lots of people have published in it, and you move down that setting. Now, if I'm to be very honest, when I learned about PAP when I was a student too, and thought, oh yeah, that sounds cool. You know, the old theory that Ben Johnson did, you know, squats before training or whatever to improve performance. Actually, and you now know a lot of athletes do gym on the morning of an NBA game or whatever, you know, but these sort of folklores, you know, really came big and strong and fast. And if you then read what we'll call maybe human voluntary, you know, PAPE research, you get a lot of researchers saying, hey, look, we got some performance enhancement. We did a jump, we did something else, and sometime later they jumped further. And of course, you've got this potential mechanism because you've read about PAP, you know, and it all makes a lot of sense. So I started to think, I had a student, a PhD student, who wanted to do some PAP research. He was an applied sports scientist, a strength and conditioning guy. And I said, okay, I'm really interested in this idea because when I was a shot putter as a little kid, I used to throw the heavy shot. And if I threw the heavy shot and warm up, I always performed better than if I didn't have a heavier shot available to warm up with. So even as a 10-year-old, I knew that I could change the load in warm-up and get a performance enhancement. So I was always into this idea of PAP. soon as we started rereading the research, as you should do, you read all the basic research, you start to notice one big issue with the applied stuff. And that is that no one was doing full warm-ups, which is interesting because if you're an applied scientist, you should be very, very good at replicating what happens in the applied setting. You should say, okay, I have an athlete and I want to improve that person's performance. I have a hypothesis that performing a sled toe or a loaded squat or something might enhance performance. That's my hypothesis. And I want to know if this is going to enhance athletic performance. So as an applied scientist, your job is to know what athletes do and say, okay, they're going to perform at this time of day. They're going to have eaten this sort of food. They're going to have slept like this. They're going to come in, and this is the warm-up they normally do. And what I want to know is, can I do the warm-up and then add something to it that improves performance more? Or can I shorten the warm-up, but still do it, because they're not going to get rid of the warm-up. They could maybe abbreviate it and then add this extra thing, right? So that the total amount of warm-up is about the same. You've just changed part of it. That, to me, would be an appropriate experimental design. But in the research setting, there seemed to be this sort of consistent methodological design where we would just give a 5-minute stationary cycle. Or in fact, a lot of papers weren't saying they did any kind of warm-up at all. And then they would do their sprint run or their vertical jump test. And then they would give some sort of conditioning activity and find an enhancement later. And I thought, well, hang on, you've just warmed up a bit. So of course, you know, based on the basics of warm-up, you're likely to see a performance enhancement. And actually the thing that really occurred to me that was weird is that I know if I warm up now, you could test me 20 seconds later and I improve. Why is it that there was no performance enhancement in many papers until 5, 6, 7, or 8 minutes later? That was really weird to me. And a lot of people said, oh, that's because of this potentiation and fatigue occurring together. I thought, well, that's really interesting because I do strength and conditioning because I think of myself as an applied scientist. And I know that if I do 4 heavy squats, I could then do those 4 heavy squats maybe after a 30-second rest and I still feel great. I don't feel that there is so much fatigue. So I went to the research and found studies showing that usually after a set of bench press or a set of squats, you're back to peak performance again by about 1 minute, and that giving 2 or 3 or 4 minutes rest didn't help, at least when you're only doing 2 sets. Of course, if you do many, many sets, you know, you need 3, 4, 5 minutes recovery. But after a single set, it looked like after that small amount of work, you could recover quite quickly. So why are we seeing 5, 6, 7-minute delays? That doesn't sound like fatigue to me. So then we went back and had a look at the actual classic PAP studies. And when they talk about fatigue and potentiation, you're talking about seconds. So if you give a muscle fiber or a whole muscle an activity, and then you measure the myosin phosphorylation state, or you give it a twitch contraction, which was thought to be telling us about this phosphorylated state, you would almost immediately see the peak of PAP. Almost immediately. And when they talk about this, the reason you don't see it absolutely immediately is because of fatigue mixing in with the potentiation. They're talking about the first few seconds. And for some reason, maybe because people didn't read those papers properly, applied people said, oh, that fatigue and potentiation conflict could be the cause of this delayed response. But remember, the delay because of fatigue is literally seconds. And even if we do whole body dynamic activity, if you did 4 vertical jumps right now, you're not fatigued for 5 minutes. Yep. So there were a lot of things that didn't make sense, you know, so I kind of got into the PAP field. We did some studies, you know, and it kept bothering me after this that there was this conflict. And that's when I decided that it was time to do a full review. Let's look at the history of this thing. Let's look at the physiology of this thing. When you marry up the time course of classic PAP, which is almost immediate, and then loses its effect very, very rapidly compared to the voluntary thing we were seeing, which is a whole different time course, you realize that if the time courses are completely different, they're probably different phenomena. And when you start with this idea and then look at the data as I did in that paper, everywhere you look, you can see that these are 2 very, very distinct effects. In fact, researchers many, many decades ago had already said that the phosphorylated state, this classic PAP, is probably the normal operating state of a muscle. It's not exceptional. It's very quick to activate this PAP mechanism. And so therefore, you know, we knew 70 years ago that doing extra stuff won't give us extra PAP. If we're getting extra performance enhancement, it must be for other reasons. And of course, a majority of that is probably the muscle temperature that wasn't high because no one gave a warm-up. No one did the proper warm-up. And if we had done the proper warm-up, we might have known about this right from the start. So that's sort of the history of what got me into that field.
So in that sense, the PAP effect, it's in a way simply just a warm-up effect or a warm-up with certain high intensity activity.
Yeah.
And what do you think is the reason for that long delay?
So our best guess at the moment is that delay is a motor pattern interference. So just like I said, if you perform a task that is similar but not the same, you interfere with movement patterns. Many years ago, I think we published it in 2009, we were looking at the effect of stretching on function with Tony Kay. And one of the studies, we decided to see if doing muscle contractions could kind of overcome the effect of the stretch. You know, you're thinking, oh, you know, stretching goes down, maybe potentiation and warm-up would go up. And what he did was a concentric activity. So his test was a concentric knee, actually I think it was plantar flexion. So concentric plantar flexion. He then did 6 isometric MVCs and then retested concentric force. And each MVC was identical. So there's clearly no fatigue because people who do a 5-second MVC, wait 5 or 10 seconds, I have to go and check the paper, do another 5-second MVC. And if you got people to do 6 of these things, all the performances were the same. So there's clearly no fatigue in these MVCs because they performed them all identically at max. But then he redid his test contraction to see what would happen, and it was down. So the concentric performance was negatively affected, but the isometric was not. So if you repeat the same task, there was no fatigue, but if you then went back to immediately do the old task, there was a decrement in performance. We don't think that's fatigue. We thought that must be movement pattern interference, some loss of central drive. We then gave stretching, and there was a bit more effect, but the total effect was the same as if you just did the stretching. In other words, it looks like, you know, the isometrics were ruining concentric performance by something like the same mechanism that stretching was affecting us. We know stretching is largely a central drive failure, so we thought that this isometric stuff was something to do with central drive failure. Now, we then went and read lots of papers, and we found, of course, things like the studies on thumb adductors, and we saw studies on perseveration in occupational tasks and in things like triathlon, going from cycling to running. We saw perseveration in lots and lots of things, from mental tasks to physical tasks. And we came to the conclusion that it's very clear that no matter what you do in life, if you do 2 things that are similar right next to each other, they can interfere. In fact, we have now just completed a study that we're writing up right now, and the results are very clear. Our test condition was just a 180 degree per second knee extension, fast and hard as you possibly can. And we look at the torque in the 180 degree per second knee extension. We then gave people task practice, and that was a few knee extensions with 30 seconds rest. So you do a single one, wait 30 seconds. And the idea is there's no fatigue when you do that. We also had indwelling temperature probes, and we were hoping not to see much increase in temperature either. We saw around about 0.5 of a degree, so there was some, but not a lot. But after that, and what we did was we allowed people to do the knee extension until 3 contractions in a row were within just 3%, not 5%, 3%. So that suggested that they were not improving anymore with the task practice. We then measured both the peak EMG and also that early EMG burst, because in a high speed, high power activity, it's the EMG or the muscle activation in those first milliseconds that actually dictate what happens later in the task. And what we found was that the task practice significantly increased the activation, the EMG, in that first burst. It also increased the peak EMG, but it's that first burst that was so stark. After task practice, we then gave them a conditioning activity. We gave them either a slow speed, so now 60 degrees per second, or over speed, 300 degrees per second. In the slow speed, performance had gone up with task practice, and then after a 60 degree per second conditioning activity, they lost performance. It went back to baseline. Now remember, most studies in PAP don't do task-specific practice. They simply do the conditioning activity and they find no immediate effect. And that's kind of what we found. We found that if you just looked at baseline and then looked immediately after the conditioning activity, there's no change. Of course, we know that there was a problem because task practice had already improved performance and now it's gone back to baseline. What's the big difference here? Temperature went up. So why didn't performance go up? Well, our EMG burst, boom, flatlined. That early EMG burst was dramatically reduced and the peak EMG was also slightly reduced. So what we have evidence of here is that if you go from doing task practice to doing a very similar task but now slow and heavier, you lose the ability to rapidly activate the muscle. And over 5, and we then tested at 5 and 9 minutes and it came back over 5 and 9 minutes. And of course, what happens to performance? By 9 minutes, we had this nice performance enhancement again. So what that shows to us is task practice improved it, and these slow speed, heavy conditioning activities we like actually ruined performance. And it took time to come out of that. That wasn't associated with any measure of fatigue that we had. We did tetanic contractions, twitch contractions, EMG measurements, everything. There was no evidence that this was caused by fatigue. The only evidence was that the ability to activate the muscle was reduced. And what seems to be happening is you get this nice temperature rise, but you can't make the most of the temperature because our conditioning activity has negatively affected movement pattern. Now, what's really important here is we also had an overspeed condition. Now, the overspeed 300 degrees per second sounds very fast compared to the 180 degree per second test, but it's less than twice different, whereas 60 degree per second is 3 times different. So effectively, the overspeed task is not so different. And we did not see the massive decrement in performance. We did not see the massive loss of EMG. In other words, it is possible to give a conditioning activity that has about the same, actually had more work. So theoretically, it had the same time under contraction. So it had more work. Theoretically, it should have given more fatigue. Of course, it didn't. And of course, it didn't ruin performance. So having more potential for fatigue did not reduce the performance. So this is not a fatigue effect. This is a motor pattern effect. And when you do a task that's much better, high speed, for example, you don't get that decrement. You simply see your performance enhancement. So in the overspeed condition, you see the increase with task practice, and then you see a slight further improvement after the high speed conditioning activity, and it's maintained. So in other words, immediately after the conditioning activity, you've still got performance enhancement. So this idea that you get this delay and a later rise, actually, I'm now convinced that if you see that, you've actually caused performance decrement. So most of the PAP studies, my conclusion based on these data, is that most studies that try to implement some funky conditioning activity to enhance performance, where they don't really warm them up, and then they do the conditioning activity, and then they don't see any performance enhancement for at least several minutes, what they are doing is simply warming them up to get muscle temperature up, but they're doing it using a non-specific task, and so they are affecting negatively the movement pattern. And what you need to do is wait some time to overcome that perseveration. So now you can actually perform the task better. If, however, you had have simply performed a proper warm-up, PAP is super classic PAP, true PAP. It's so easy to evoke. You've already got it. The proper warm-up gives you the muscle temperature, but the proper warm-up gives you lots of task-specific practice. So immediately after warm-up, you've enhanced performance. So I'm not sure why we're going to bother doing these funky tasks. I will only give you one caveat at all. And that is, it still might be possible to muck around with your tasks and get a performance enhancement. And we have seen this when we did a vertical jump, but in a warm-up, we did squats using elastic bands. Because as you know, squats are heavy at the bottom, but not at the top. So he said, well, what if we take off some load at the bottom, but increase the load toward the top? And what we found was that vertical jump performance was enhanced. And this is after what we consider to be a very comprehensive warm-up. So they fully warmed up, did lots of vertical jump practice, did the test. We then either gave them squats, which didn't improve them at all, because why would it? It's non-specific, and all the other tests, a lot of studies that show that squats improve vertical jump. That happens only when you haven't done the practice or the warm-up. But when we gave them elastic bands, what we found was that there was a slight enhancement in vertical jump performance. It was immediate, by the way. It's not the delayed response. It's just an immediate enhancement in performance, and it's continuous for at least 12 minutes. And that enhancement in vertical jump was associated with an improved EMG. So what we feel has happened is that by slightly modifying one of the warm-up tasks so that it was harder at the top range where normally it's easy and there's no real load, we believe we were able to maybe alter the nervous system to activate just a bit better. And this was associated with a performance enhancement. So this shows us that whilst I would not consider that the majority of PAP studies are useful to us in elite sport because they simply show that they've ruined the athlete, we do have at least one instance, and there are a few others in the literature where it looks like they have warmed people up, then done something a bit funky and enhanced performance more. And I think that this is really worth looking at if you design your studies properly.
Yeah, we are short of time. Thank you for the comprehensive explanation.
No problem at all. Sorry, they're long answers, but it's quite a complex topic.
That's great. Yeah, like we need a lot more information on that. And yeah, really appreciate your time for today. Thank you very much. If there's any questions coming up, I'll probably email you on it.
Yep, no problem at all. Good to talk to you. Have a great rest of your day. Cheers. Good to say hi.
Okay.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
We've come to the end of the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll find the conversation insightful. Thanks. See you next time.